I've investigated some dark cases, but this is different. This is the story of how hundreds of men were erased, not killed. They left no bodies, only their shadows, permanently burned into the concrete. For 30 years, the official lie was a simple plane crash. But the truth, hidden in a top-secret KGB file, is infinitely more shameful. It involves a top Soviet marshal, a single act of fatal arrogance on a wooden stool, and a 3,000-degree inferno that happened in total silence. The most damning evidence? A forbidden film that captured the moment they all vanished. In this video, I'm going to detail exactly what that film shows, frame by frame. The full story of the negligence, the political pressure, and the cover-up is truly unbelievable. Trust me, you need to see this to the end. If you appreciate this kind of deep dive, please subscribe to the channel, hit that like button if you agree the truth must be told, and let me know your thoughts in the comments below. The case file concerning Marshal Mitrofan Ivanovich Nedelin, designated Hero of the Soviet Union and the inaugural Commander-in-Chief of the Strategic Missile Forces, establishes him as a figure of supreme national importance. His entire career was a trajectory of ascent, culminating in his command of the most critical new branch of the Soviet armed forces, the nuclear shield. His profile was that of a consummate artilleryman, a tough disciplinarian from the old school of the Great Patriotic War, entrusted with the awesome responsibility of parity in the atomic age. His command was absolute, his focus singular: to develop and deploy intercontinental ballistic missiles capable of reaching any adversary. The pressure on him and on his program was immense, emanating directly from the highest echelons of the state. This file, however, shows an abrupt and clean termination. On October 24, 1960, Marshal Nedelin's active service concluded. The official state bulletin, released after a brief but conspicuous delay, was concise and devoid of operational details. It stated that Marshal Nedelin, along with a number of accompanying officers and engineering specialists, had perished in an aviation accident. The narrative was simple. A transport plane carrying this vital cadre had suffered a catastrophic failure while the men were executing their official duties. The media, including the central organ Pravda, disseminated this version uniformly. The obituaries were solemn, praising the marshal as a faithful son of the Cardi and a brilliant military leader, lost in a tragic but ultimately unremarkable accident. A state funeral was arranged, and the remains were interred with full military honors. From a procedural standpoint, the official narrative was implemented with extreme efficiency. The aviation accident provided a complete closed-loop explanation. It was plausible, tragic, and, most importantly, nonspecific. Details regarding the type of aircraft, the exact location of the crash, or the manifest of passengers and crew were immediately classified, citing the sensitive nature of the mission they were ostensibly performing. This act of classification effectively sealed the incident from any external inquiry. The official story of a plane crash was not just a report, it was a carefully constructed information barrier. It normalized the abnormal, turning a sudden, massive loss of high-level personnel into a manageable tragedy. For the outside world, and for the Soviet populace, the case was closed. But for those within military counterintelligence, the very neatness of the story, the total lack of peripheral evidence, no scattered wreckage, no complex recovery operation, was not an answer. It was the beginning of a problem. The official narrative, constructed for public consumption, was an exercise in information control. Internally, within the prioritized channels of state security, the event registered not as an aviation accident, but as a catastrophic failure of protocol and communication. The signal that triggered the actual investigation was a sudden and total cessation of all contact from the 41st Launch Complex at the Tyura-Tam test range. This facility, known only by its coded designators, was the most secure and sensitive military installation in the Soviet Union. When it went silent, the highest levels of the KGB were alerted within minutes. This alert coincided exactly with the known location of Marshal Nedelin, who was personally overseeing the final preparations of the R-16 missile. The discrepancy was immediate and absolute. A marshal cannot be in a plane crash over an unspecified location while also being present at a ground facility that has just dropped off the grid. This is where the file is activated for Major Anton Volkov. Volkov was not a standard investigator. He was a senior operative in the 3rd Chief Directorate of the KGB. This directorate was responsible for internal security and counterintelligence within the Soviet armed forces. Volkov's specialization was high-stakes failures, sabotage, and breaches of secrecy within the most sensitive branches, specifically the nascent strategic missile forces. He was a product of the system, analytical, methodical, and possessing the highest level of security clearance. He was trusted not just to find facts, but to understand their political implications, and, above all, to ensure containment. His arrival was authorized by the very top of the committee, bypassing standard military command chains. Volkov's orders were delivered in a sealed, special importance dossier. His mandate was not to investigate an accident, but to conduct a full-spectrum special investigation into the event at Tyura-Tam. His primary objectives were clear and prioritized. First, ascertain the precise cause of the event. Was it technical failure, gross negligence, or, the most volatile possibility, sabotage? Second, establish the full extent of the human and material losses, including a definitive list of all personnel involved, prioritizing high-value assets like Nedelin and the Design Bureau leadership. Third, assess the immediate security of the test range, neutralize any ongoing threats, and prevent any information leakage, either external to foreign intelligence or internal to the wider military. He was dispatched immediately, traveling under secure cover with priority access to all transport and communications. His investigation was to be absolute, answerable only to Moscow. As he traveled toward the vast, empty steppe of Kazakhstan, he was moving toward a truth that was already being actively and officially buried. The facility designated Scientific Research Test Range No. 5, NIP-5, known operationally as Tyura-Tam, existed as a geographical impossibility. It was a sprawling, high-technology city conjured from nothing in the barren, featureless expanse of the Kazakh steppe. Its location was selected for its primary virtues, isolation and secrecy. This was the true center of the Soviet universe, the point of origin for Sputnik and the Vostok program, a place that technically did not exist on any public map. It was protected by multiple security perimeters, air defense grids, and an entire dedicated division of KGB border guards tasked not with guarding a border, but with isolating the facility from the nation it served. Access was compartmentalized to an extreme degree. Engineers working on the R-7 booster at one complex had no clearance or knowledge of the activities at another. It was a state within a state, governed by military protocol and the absolute priority of the missile program. Major Volkov's transport aircraft bypassed the main civilian-adjacent airfields, landing instead at a military strip deep within the range's secure zone. The moment he stepped onto the tarmac, the atmosphere was palpably wrong. The usual rigid, procedural discipline of a strategic facility was fractured. He was met not by the range commander, but by the shaken head of the local special department, the 3rd Directorate's field office. The authority Volkov carried in his special importance dossier superseded all local command. He did not proceed to the disaster site. His first priority was containment. He established his operational base in the Special Department's secure offices within the range headquarters. The facility was already on lockdown, but it was a reactive, panicked lockdown. Volkov formalized it, turning the base into an information black hole. His first orders were absolute, a total communications blackout. All telephone and telegraph lines connecting Tyura-Tam to the outside world were to be physically disconnected, routed exclusively through his command post. All outgoing and incoming personal mail for the thousands of personnel and residents of the adjoining closed city of Leninsk was suspended and seized. An armed cordon of internal troops was thrown around the residential city, separating the families and civilian technicians from the military zones. A second, more severe cordon was established miles around the perimeter of the affected area, Launch Complex 41. No one moved in or out without Volkov's direct, written authorization. The local command was visibly paralyzed, caught between the shock of the event and the arrival of Moscow's highest level of scrutiny. The base was now sealed, not just from the West, but from the Soviet Union itself. Only now, with the quarantine secured, did Volkov begin requisitioning the initial incident reports, personnel manifests for Complex 41, and secure transport to the epicenter. From his secured command post within the Tyura-Tam Special Department, Major Volkov requisitioned the complete Special Importance dossier on Project R-16, industrial designation 8K64. This file was the object at the center of the anomaly, the reason for the presence of Marshal Nedelin and the entire upper echelon of the missile program. The file that arrived was thick, detailing a program of the highest national priority. The R-16 was not the R-7, the successful kerosene-fueled booster that had launched Sputnik. The 8K64 was a different, more terrifying beast, a true intercontinental ballistic missile designed for immediate military readiness. Volkov, an expert in munitions and technical sabotage, focused on the propulsion specifications. The R-16 was the first of its kind, designed by Chief Designer Mikhail Yungel's bureau, OKB 586. Its critical innovation was its fuel. It did not use stable kerosene or cryogenic liquid oxygen, which required hours of preparation to fuel. The R-16 used hypergolic propellants, unsymmetrical dimethylhydrazine as fuel, and a nitric acid-based oxidizer. These components were volatile, extraordinarily toxic, and had the terrifying property of igniting instantly and explosively upon contact with each other. This was the devil's venom. But this property was also its strategic genius. The missile could be pre-fueled and kept in a state of readiness for months, capable of launching in minutes, not hours. It was the ultimate first-strike weapon. However, as Volkov scrutinized the testing logs and engineering reports, a clear pattern of critical failure emerged. The project was plagued by systemic issues. The new engines, the complex fuel plumbing, the autonomous guidance system, all were experimental and suffering repeated failures during bench testing. Reports from Yungel's engineers repeatedly flagged the fuel systems as dangerously unreliable. But overriding these technical warnings was another, more powerful set of documents, copies of secured telegrams and directives originating from the Kremlin. Volkov located the central directive signed by First Secretary Nikita Khrushchev himself. The R-16 was not just a military project, it was a political tool. Khrushchev was scheduled for a high-profile appearance at the United Nations and wanted to demonstrate a quantum leap in Soviet missile capability. The directive was unambiguous. A successful full-range launch of the R-16 was to be conducted no later than the anniversary of the October Revolution, November 7th. The file laid the motive bare. An arbitrary political deadline had been imposed on a deeply flawed, experimental, and extraordinarily dangerous piece of technology. The pressure to meet this date, Volkov deduced, must have been immense, flowing down from the First Secretary to Marshal Nedelin, and from Nedelin down to the engineers on the pad. The R-16 file was not a record of engineering, it was a chronicle of mandated haste. This political imperative had set the stage, turning the launch pad into a pressure cooker, forcing technicians and commanders alike to cut corners on a system that offered zero margin for error. Major Volkov's next step was to reconstruct the timeline of the event itself. The Special Importance dossier on the R-16 provided the motive, the political deadline. Now he needed the precise mechanics of the failure. He requisitioned the operational logs for Launch Complex 41, the personnel duty roster for October 24, 1960, and the initial sensor readings from perimeter monitoring stations. The documents that arrived, compiled by a shell-shocked and decimated local command, painted a picture of systemic breakdown. The duty roster for Pad 41 was the first confirmation. It listed not only the requisite launch crews and engineering teams from Yangel's OKB, but also Marshal Nedelin himself, several high-ranking generals of his staff, and the chief designers of the missile's core systems. They were all registered as present at launch site, not in the protected command bunker located hundreds of meters away, but on the concrete pad itself. This was a catastrophic breach of safety protocol. The Marshal, in an apparent effort to visibly push the frantic technicians to meet the deadline, had placed himself, his staff, and the program's entire brain trust in the immediate vicinity of a fully fueled experimental rocket. The technical logs from the bunker, which had survived, detailed the hours leading up to the disaster. The R-16 was in a red state, plagued by faults. The primary culprit was the program current distributor, the complex electrical sequencer that controlled the launch. It was malfunctioning, sending stray signals. The teams were attempting to bypass and reset the system. Crucially, Volkov noted, the logs confirmed the rocket was fully loaded with its hypogolic propellants. All work on a fueled missile was expressly forbidden. At approximately 1845 Moscow time, the logs ceased. The next entries in Volkov's file were the automated sensor reports from observation posts several kilometers distant. They did not register an acoustic event first. They registered a light anomaly, an instantaneous, blinding white-yellow flash originating at Pad 41, which rapidly expanded into a massive, roiling fireball, followed seconds later by the arrival of a concussive shockwave. The heat signature was astronomical, peaking in milliseconds. Volkov, reviewing the technical schematics of the R-16, synthesized the data. The only logical conclusion was that the faulty sequencer, during the attempted reset, had prematurely sent the command to ignite the second-stage engines. This engine fired while still inside the missile, blasting downward. It instantly ruptured the first-stage fuel and oxidizer tanks directly beneath it. The devil's venom, the UDMH and nitric acid, mixed. The result was not an explosion in the conventional sense. It was a silent, instantaneous chemical ignition. A hypergolic inferno that burned at over 3,000 degrees Celsius, expanding in a flash, vaporizing steel, concrete, and human tissue with equal efficiency. The hundreds of personnel on the pad, including the Marshal, were consumed before the sound of the event even reached the distant command bunker. Having assimilated the preliminary data, the timeline, the political pressure, and the sensor readings confirming a thermal anomaly, Major Volkov proceeded to the physical site. Launch Complex 41 was quarantined, locked down even from the internal troops that formed the outer cordon. Access required full chemical and biological protective suits. The air for kilometers around the pad was still considered lethally toxic, saturated with nitric acid vapors and unburnt hydrazine compounds. Volkov, accompanied by a small team of KGB forensic and chemical warfare specialists, passed through 3 checkpoints, each one recording their entry and exit in a new, segregated logbook. The silence of the journey was absolute, broken only by the hiss of the respirators. The scene that confronted him was not one of conventional destruction. There was no deep crater, no vast debris field associated with a high explosive detonation. Instead, Ground Zero was a zone of profound, silent alteration. The epicenter was the launch pad itself, a massive, multi-level concrete and steel structure. It was now a monument of fused, warped metal. The colossal gantry towers, designed to withstand the indirect thrust of a normal launch, had slumped and twisted, their structural integrity annihilated by heat, not kinetic force. Steel girders hung like melted wax. The ground was not cratered, it was flashed. The concrete was scorched black, calcined, and in some areas had vitrified into a glassy dark crust. A penetrating, acrid stench of burnt chemicals and ozone hung in the air, a smell so potent it seemed to breach the rubber seals of their masks. Volkov moved with methodical purpose, his boots crunching on the brittle, charred surface. His team fanned out, taking radiation and toxicity readings, which were high but confirmed a chemical, not nuclear event. Volkov's objective was the last known position of the command staff. He navigated to the spot near the base of the pad where reports indicated Marshal Nedelin had positioned himself. He found it. There were no remains. There was no equipment. There was nothing but a dark patch on the concrete and, impossibly, the carbonized remnants of a simple wooden stool. The marshal, the generals, the chief designers, they had not been killed in a recognizable way. They had been erased, reduced to their constituent atoms in a fraction of a second. This lack of physical remains presented Volkov with a severe procedural problem. It was one thing to claim an aviation accident, it was another to produce no bodies for the state funeral. Expanding the inspection perimeter outward from the epicenter, the fused metal platform where the missile itself had stood, Major Volkov and his forensic specialists began a systematic grid search of the entire launch complex. The initial assessment, documented in Chapter 6, had confirmed the vaporization of the high command near the pad's edge. Now, the objective was to quantify the full scope of the loss. The duty roster listed over 250 personnel, including technicians, soldiers, and civilian engineers, who were registered as being on site during the final frantic repair attempts. As the team moved across the vast blackened apron, a pattern began to emerge, one that defied conventional forensic understanding. They were not finding fragments or remains. They were finding outlines. Burned into the surface of the concrete, starkly visible against the lighter, heat-blasted stone, were dark, human-shaped patches. They were ubiquitous. A silhouette was found near a fueling hydrant, the posture frozen in the act of turning a valve. Another, near a cabling trench, was crouched, the shadow of the man and his toolbox fused into a single dark shape. Further out, near the perimeter fences, they found running figures, their forms elongated and distorted, permanently etched onto the ground in their final, desperate motion. These were the shadows on the concrete. Volkov, applying his knowledge of high-energy events, immediately understood the horrifying physics at play. This was not scorching from fire, it was a record of shielding. The hypergolic inferno had erupted with the intensity of a small sun, a multi-thousand-degree wave of thermal radiation that flashed across the complex in a fraction of a second. This thermal pulse bleached and calcined the exposed concrete. The bodies of the men, however, instantaneously absorbed this energy. For that 1 millisecond, they acted as shields. The concrete beneath them was protected from the pulse, retaining its original, darker color, while the concrete around them was blasted white. When the bodies themselves were subsequently vaporized by the sustained heat, they left behind these perfect, chilling negatives. It was an effect previously associated only with the thermal flash of nuclear detonations. This discovery transformed the investigation. The team's grim task shifted from recovery to inventory. Volkov ordered every single shadow to be photographed, measured, and plotted on a master schematic of the launch pad. This schematic became the only true list of the dead. It was a visceral, graphic testament to the event's instantaneous nature and appalling power, a silent census of the lost. The shadows were the case's most disturbing and definitive clue. They provided irrefutable physical evidence of a massive, ground-level thermal event, utterly contradicting the official narrative of an aviation accident that was already being finalized in Moscow. With the physical evidence from Ground Zero cataloged, the fused metal, the chemical residue, and the silent, harrowing shadows, Major Volkov shifted the focus of the investigation to the human element, the survivors. This was not a search for heroes or victims, but a methodical harvesting of sensory data and psychological observation. The survivors were located in two primary areas, the base medical facility and a specialized barracks set aside for quarantine and interrogation. All were held under armed guard, segregated by rank and proximity to the event, their contact with the outside world severed as completely as the base's main communication lines. Volkov's priority was not their medical treatment, which was being handled by frantic base doctors, but the immediate documentation of their testimony before shock, collaboration, or official directives could contaminate their recollections. The interviews began with the personnel from the command bunker. These men were the least physically harmed, shielded by meters of reinforced concrete. Their testimony was coherent but surreal. They reported observing the final preparations through optical periscopes. They saw the Marshal on the pad. They confirmed the frantic activity around the missile's upper stages. Then, their optics were instantly and permanently blinded by a flash of such intensity it burned the lenses. Seconds later, the bunker itself, built to withstand a nearby nuclear detonation, was violently rocked by the concussive, low-frequency shockwave that followed the silent flash. Far more critical and far more difficult were the accounts of the handful of men who had been on the launch apron itself and survived. These men were in the medical wing, suffering from catastrophic thermal burns and, more acutely, severe chemical damage to their lungs from the vaporized acid and fuel. Their testimony, extracted by KGB investigators at their bedsides, was fragmented by pain and deep psychological trauma. They described a world that did not explode, but was simply replaced by fire. There was no sequential boom. There was only a soundless, instantaneous white light that felt like the sun. They described seeing colleagues running one moment, turning into pillars of black smoke the next. They spoke of the air itself becoming poison, a tangible, burning substance that dissolved the throat. It was within this fog of trauma that Volkov's investigators isolated the first vector of disinformation. A recurring detail emerged, particularly from perimeter guards and personnel on the complex's periphery. The event, they claimed, was preceded by a blue flash from the sky. This narrative of an external, almost supernatural intervention began to propagate through the quarantined base. It was a classic manifestation of mass hysteria. The human mind, unable to process the scale of a systemic, man-made failure, invented an external, quasi-divine cause. This blue flash story became a superstition, a ghost story that provided a more palatable, external explanation than the terrifying, mundane truth of negligence. Volkov documented this phenomenon not as a fact, but as a critical psychological contaminant, a myth that was already running interference for the truth. Major Volkov, operating from the secured headquarters, approached the recurring witness reports of a blue flash from the sky with the procedural gravity of his counterintelligence mandate. The witness accounts, documented in Chapter 8, were tainted by trauma. But this specific anomaly, the blue flash, could not be dismissed purely as a psychological artifact, not yet. It represented the only data point supporting an external attack or sabotage vector. A blue flash could imply many things: a targeted electromagnetic pulse, a directed energy weapon, or an explosive device delivered by air, all of which fell under Volkov's primary investigative directive to rule out enemy action. He therefore initiated a secondary inquiry, parallel to the ground zero forensics, aimed exclusively at validating or debunking this phenomenon. His first directive was to the command post of the Tyura-Tam air defense and long-range radar networks. He requisitioned all surveillance logs, radar, telemetry, and radio intercepts for the 12-hour period surrounding the 1845 event. He was searching for any unregistered object in the airspace, any anomalous radar signature, or any atmospheric disturbance. The reports that returned within the hour were definitive. The logs were clean. The skies over Tyura-Tam, one of the most heavily monitored airspaces on the planet, were empty. There were no bogeys, no unexplained meteorological events, and no electronic signatures consistent with an attack. This physical data provided a direct contradiction to the witness claims. Volkov then cross-referenced the technical data of the disaster itself. The event was not an explosion. It was a hypergolic ignition. The instantaneous chemical reaction of the UDMH and nitric acid would have released a colossal wave of energy, primarily in the thermal and visible light spectrum. His chemical specialists confirmed that such a massive, rapid ionization of the surrounding atmosphere could, in the first milliseconds, produce a brief spectral corona, a flash of blue spectrum light as the air itself was torn apart by the energy release, immediately preceding the main blinding white thermal pulse. Therefore, if the blue flash was seen, it was not the cause, it was the effect. It was the ignition's chemical signature, not an external weapon. With this, the blue flash myth was forensically neutralized. Volkov classified the phenomenon as a combination of two things: a real misidentified chemical artifact seen by peripheral witnesses, and a psychological contagion that spread among the survivors. The mind, seeking an external agent for an incomprehensible internal failure, seized upon this trivial optical effect and elevated it to the status of a cause. By formally debunking the myth, Volkov officially closed the external sabotage line of inquiry. The investigation now contracted, turning away from the sky and focusing entirely inward. The cause of the catastrophe was not an enemy. It was located inside the R-16 and among the men who were working on it. With the external sabotage vector forensically eliminated, as documented in Chapter 9, Major Volkov's investigation contracted to a single point: the internal chain of command and the R-16 missile itself. The most critical living asset was the missile's creator, chief designer Mikhail Yangel. Yangel had survived, a fact that was both a miracle and a procedural necessity for Volkov. He was located not in the main command bunker, but in a small separate instrumentation block near the perimeter, having stepped away for a moment, an act of random chance that saved his life. He was now under guard, in deep shock, physically unharmed but psychologically shattered. Volkov ordered Yangel brought to the secured Special Department offices. This was not a conversation. It was a formal interrogation of the investigation's primary subject. Yangel, a man who commanded an entire design bureau, entered as a person of interest in a state-level catastrophe. Volkov began not with accusations, but with the files, the technical dockets for the R-16. He laid out the reports, the ones referenced in Chapter 4, which had been submitted by Yangel's own engineers. They detailed the repeated, critical failures of the new electrical program distributor. This component was the missile's nervous system, the sequencer responsible for activating all launch events, and the reports clearly stated it was unstable. Volkov's line of inquiry was direct. Given this known, documented instability in the launch sequencer, why was the missile on the pad fueled? And why, in direct violation of all safety protocols, was a 250-man team conducting hands-on electrical repairs on a fully fueled rocket? Yangel's testimony, when it came, was the final human piece of the puzzle. He confirmed the political pressure from the Kremlin was unbearable. The November 7th deadline was absolute and non-negotiable. He then recounted the final hours. The electrical sequencer had failed, creating a fault that placed the missile systems in an undefined state. Yangel himself had insisted the only safe course of action was to drain the volatile hypergolic propellants, a process that would take days before attempting any repairs. This was the critical juncture. According to Yangel's testimony, Marshal Nedelin had personally and explicitly overruled him. The Marshal, acting as the ultimate authority, declared that there was no time to drain the fuel. Driven by the Kremlin's mandate, Nedelin ordered the engineers to find a workaround and reset the sequencer while the missile was live. To enforce this decision, and, in Yangel's words, to show the technicians he was with them, Nedelin took a wooden stool and placed it near the base of the rocket, sitting down to observe the repairs directly. This act of fatal impatience, this direct violation of protocol by the highest-ranking officer, was the cause. Yangel, the chief designer, was rendered powerless. His burden was that he had created the machine, but he could not control the man who commanded it. The interrogation of chief designer Yangel provided the proximal cause, Marshal Nedelin's direct order to bypass safety protocols. Now, Major Volkov's investigation was required to move up the chain of command, to formally analyze the motive for that order. The answer, already identified in the initial R-16 dossier, Chapter 4, but now requiring formal substantiation, was the November 7th deadline. Volkov's task was to shift from forensic analysis of the pad to a counterintelligence analysis of the command structure. He moved his operational center to the Tyura-Tam communications hub, seizing all encrypted high-frequency teleprinter logs and secured telephone traffic records between the launch range and Moscow for the preceding month. The evidence in these communications logs was stark. The November 7th deadline was not merely a target date, it was an absolute non-negotiable political imperative. Volkov's analytical brief, attached to this file, contextualized the pressure. The Soviet Union was in a precarious international position. Earlier in 1960, the U-2 incident involving Francis Gary Powers had deeply embarrassed Khrushchev, proving American air superiority and operational audacity. The first secretary needed a decisive strategic countermove. He needed to demonstrate that American overflights were irrelevant because the USSR possessed the ultimate club, an intercontinental missile capable of striking the U.S. mainland from Soviet soil. The R-16 was that club. Its launch was intended as a piece of global political theater, a demonstration of force timed for the anniversary of the revolution. The VC teleprinter tapes showed a daily, then hourly escalation of pressure. Directives flowed from the Kremlin to the Ministry of Defense and then directly to Marshal Nedelin. Volkov traced the marshal's replies. Nedelin, a soldier of the old school, was clearly absorbing the full force of the state's impatience. Where Yangel, the engineer, saw technical faults and dangerous instability, Nedelin, the commander, saw only the objective. His communications to Moscow were not filled with Yangel's technical cautions, they were filled with assurances. He had promised Khrushchev the launch. He had staked his reputation and the reputation of his new strategic missile forces on meeting this date. In Volkov's final analysis, this created the catastrophic vulnerability. The system lacked a safety valve for bad news. Nedelin was trapped between the engineering reality he was being told by his experts and the political reality he was being told by his leader. To inform Khrushchev that the deadline would be missed due to technical flaws would be an admission of systemic failure, his failure. He therefore chose the only other path, to force reality to bend to the political will. He amplified the pressure downward, driving the technicians past all safety limits. The catastrophe, Volkov concluded, was not born on October 24th. It was set in motion weeks earlier, in a Moscow office, when a political date was given supremacy over physical law. Major Volkov's investigation had now established a definitive hierarchy of cause. The political imperative from the first secretary was the motive. Marshal Nedelin's direct protocol-violating order was the act of command. Now, Volkov synthesized the final piece, the specific, cascading technical failures and procedural violations committed by the crews on the pad. He requisitioned the complete engineering schematics for the R-16's electrical and fuel systems, cross-referencing them with the recovered fragments of the operations logs and the frantic final entries from the surviving bunker technicians. The result was not a single error, but a catalog of negligence that rendered the disaster inevitable. The primary culprit, as identified by Yangel, was the missile's central electrical sequencer, the device responsible for managing the complex chain of events during launch. Volkov's analysis of its design schematics revealed it was a new, highly complex component that was known to be dirty, meaning it generated stray electrical signals during its operation. The standard procedure for any ground test involving this sequencer required the pyrotechnic charges, the small explosives that ignited the engines, to be physically disconnected. The electrical system would be tested cold. The logs confirmed this procedure was not followed. To save critical hours, the technicians, under Nedelin's gaze, were attempting to reset the faulty sequencer while its circuits were hot, still physically connected to the second-stage engine's igniters. This was the first violation. The second violation was the state of the missile itself. The R-16 was a prototype rushed from the factory. Its internal wiring lacked the finalized electromagnetic shielding designed to isolate sensitive circuits. The crews were thus working on a system where stray electrical signals were both highly probable and physically capable of jumping circuits. The third violation was the complete bypass of safety interlocks. The R-16, like all such systems, possessed multiple redundant safeties, both software commands and physical brake wire plugs designed to prevent an engine from firing until the missile was vertical and all umbilicals were detached. Volkov's review of the pre-launch checklist showed these interlocks had been systematically overridden or jumpered, bypassed, to allow the technicians to conduct their diagnostics on the armed system. They had, in effect, removed all the fuses from a bomb while trying to fix its timer. The final, systemic violation was the environment. The launch pad was not a sterile, controlled environment, it was a scene of chaos. Over 250 people were crowded onto the structure, a gross violation of minimum personnel protocols. None were wearing protective gear for hypergolic propellants. There was no fire suppression equipment staged. Volkov's file summarized the event with cold clarity. A stray, unshielded signal from the faulty sequencer, error 1, jumped a circuit, bypassing the disabled safety interlocks, error 2 and 3, and sent a live current to the second-stage igniters, error 4. The resulting conflagration was not an accident. It was the predictable outcome of a system where every single layer of safety had been deliberately dismantled in the name of speed. The investigation, thus far, had established a conclusive theory of the event, built upon technical schematics, incomplete logs, and the traumatized, often contradictory recollections of survivors. Major Volkov had a clear motive, the political deadline, and a clear chain of negligent command. But he lacked the final, unimpeachable element, objective, physical proof of the ignition sequence. Witness testimony, even from Chief Designer Yongel, was subjective. It could be retracted, altered by shock, or dismissed as self-serving. To finalize the case, Volkov required an unbiased witness, a pure record of the event's first milliseconds. His focus turned from the epicenter, which was a scene of total erasure, to the periphery. Any missile test, particularly one of this importance, was monitored by a suite of automatic recording devices. Volkov cross-referenced the technical plans of Launch Complex 41 with the instrumentation manifests. He was specifically looking for hardened, armored, or fire-protected camera housings designed to survive a launch anomaly. Most of the near-field cameras and sensors were simply gone, vaporized. But the blueprints indicated the presence of several automated cinematography bunkers, set back several hundred meters from the pad, built of reinforced concrete and partially buried. One of these structures was located on a berm with a perfect, unobstructed view of the R-16. It had been hit by the full force of the thermal pulse. Its thick quartz observation port was shattered and fused. The steel door was warped, requiring a cutting torch to open. Inside, the heat had been so intense that all paint had burned from the walls, and all rubber and plastic components on the equipment racks had vanished, leaving only bakelite and metal. But the primary camera, a high-speed film recorder, was not exposed. It was encased in its own protective, water-cooled, armored steel housing, bolted directly to the concrete floor. This housing was scorched black, its external fittings melted, but the case itself was not breached. The extraction was a formal forensic procedure. The housing was too heavy to move easily, so the bolts were cut. Volkov supervised its removal, ensuring the chain of custody was absolute. The armored box was sealed, labeled, and transported under guard to the secure laboratory at the Special Department headquarters. This discovery was the single most critical breakthrough of the investigation. The technical analysis and interrogations provided the why. This box, if its contents were viable, held the how. It contained the only visual record of the disaster's genesis, a silent testament that would either confirm the theory of an internal, premature second-stage ignition or give credence to the myths of an external anomaly. The armored camera housing was transported to a makeshift forensic laboratory established within the Special Department's secure headquarters. The atmosphere was sterile, a stark contrast to the chemical-laden air of the launch complex. Major Volkov was present, alongside two specialists from the KGB's technical services, experts in recovering compromised recording media. The housing itself was a testament to the event. Its thick steel was blackened and slightly warped by the thermal pulse. The quartz lens port fused into an opaque, milky slag. It took the technicians nearly an hour of precise, careful work with cutting tools and pry bars to breach the heat-sealed casing without compromising the delicate contents. Inside, the camera unit was functionally destroyed. Its internal mechanisms were melted or warped. But the critical component, the thick metal film magazine, which was itself a protective layer, was intact, though severely scorched. It was extracted in a controlled environment and immediately taken to a dedicated darkroom. The tension in this phase was procedural. The intense gamma and thermal radiation from the hypergolic fire could easily have fogged the film emulsion, rendering the entire effort useless. The technicians, working in near-total darkness, manually extracted the high-speed film and began the delicate chemical development process. Hours later, the processed film, a roll of 35mm high-speed stock, was ready. It was loaded not onto a standard projector, but onto a specialized reel-to-reel analytic projector, a machine that allowed for frame-by-frame inspection. Volkov and his senior analysts sat in the small, darkened screening room. The film began. The first several seconds were mundane. A clear, static, wide-angle shot of the R-16 missile, standing inert on the launch pad. The high resolution captured the scene with horrifying clarity. The dozens of technicians, dwarfed by the rocket, crawling over the gantry, and the cluster of high-ranking officials, including the distinct figure of Marshal Nedelin, positioned near the base. The analysts advanced the film. The scene remained static. Then, the event. On the analytic projector, they slowed the film to a crawl. The film, running at hundreds of frames per second, had captured the event in excruciating detail. It did not begin as an explosion. The first frame of the anomaly showed a small, brilliant white flash. Crucially, this flash did not originate from the ground nor from the sky. It originated inside the missile, specifically from the upper section, at the engine bay of the second stage. The subsequent frames showed this internal fire instantly rupturing the second stage's own structure, blasting downward, and then, a microsecond later, piercing the fuel and oxidizer tanks of the fully loaded first stage directly below it. Only then, as the two hypergolic components mixed in a massive, uncontrolled cascade, did the silent, expanding fireball erupt, consuming the entire pad and everyone on it. The film was the irrefutable witness. It definitively proved the cause was an internal, premature ignition of the second stage engine, just as the technical data had suggested. The investigation, having concluded with the definitive, frame-by-frame analysis of the high-speed film, was now procedurally complete. Major Volkov's final report, designated Top Secret, Special Importance, was a comprehensive synthesis of the event. It contained the eyewitness testimony, the forensic analysis of the shadows, the technical breakdown of the cascading electrical and safety failures, the interrogation of Chief Designer Yangel, and the conclusive, irrefutable proof from the armored camera. The report was transmitted via secure KGB channels, bypassing all military command, directly to the chairman of the Committee for State Security in Moscow for immediate presentation to the Presidium of the Central Committee. The arrival of this dossier triggered the true crisis. The report laid bare an intolerable reality. The nation's premier strategic weapon was dangerously unstable, and its failure was not sabotage but a direct result of systemic negligence, topped by a fatal, impatient order from the program's commander, Marshal Nedelin, who was himself acting under extreme political deadlines set by the First Secretary. The implications were catastrophic. Admitting the truth would not only provide a propaganda victory of immeasurable proportions to the West, but it would also psychologically cripple the Soviet missile program, having incinerated its own leadership. A state commission was immediately convened. This was not an investigative body, but a political one. Its members included First Secretary Khrushchev, Leonid Brezhnev, who oversaw the military-industrial complex, and the heads of the KGB and the Ministry of Defense. They were not deliberating guilt. Volkov's report had established that. They were deliberating consequences. The decision was swift and unanimous. The truth, as documented in Volkov's file, must be completely suppressed. The state could not be seen to have failed this spectacularly. A new official narrative was required, one that was tragic but clean. The aviation accident narrative was selected. It was the only explanation that plausibly accounted for the simultaneous loss of the Marshal and his entire senior staff in a single event, while critically detaching their demise from the Tyura-Tam test range and the existence of the R-16 missile. This decision immediately cascaded into a series of top-secret operational directives. Volkov's file was ordered sealed and buried in the deepest KGB archive. The armored film was classified as an object of state secrets, never to be viewed outside this committee. All surviving witnesses, from engineers to soldiers, were to be individually processed by the Special Department, bound by lifelong, state-enforced non-disclosure agreements. Their silence was to be absolute. The blue flash myth and other superstitions were to be quietly encouraged among the low-level staff, as they provided a useful, non-technical misdirection. The cover-up was now state policy. The Kremlin's directive, issued following their review of the conclusive evidence, transformed the nature of the operation at Tyura-Tam. Major Volkov's role as chief investigator was terminated. His new and final mandate was procedural, the complete and total sanitization of the event and the permanent sealing of all findings. His comprehensive report, the C-file, containing the photographic negatives of the shadows, the forensic analysis of the fused pad, the transcribed interrogation of Yangel, and the technical schematics, was consolidated. The high-speed film, now the single most dangerous artifact of the investigation, was placed in a sealed, lead-lined canister marked with a unique archival designator and prepared for armed courier transport directly to the KGB's Central Archives in Moscow. The operational phase of the cover-up began immediately. The first priority was the physical evidence, Launch Complex 41 itself. The site was a graphic, undeniable testament to the disaster, and it could not be allowed to exist. A new engineering corps, composed of internal troops sworn to secrecy, was brought in under the guise of site decontamination and reconstruction. Their actual task was erasure. Under the supervision of Special Department officers, these teams, working in full protective gear, began the systematic destruction of the launch pad. The most disturbing task was the removal of the shadows on the concrete. They were systematically scoured from the surface using industrial grinders and chemical solvents, destroying the last physical evidence of the incinerated personnel. The fused steel gantries were cut apart, and the entire structure was eventually demolished, its remnants buried in deep pits and covered with new concrete. Simultaneously, the procedural handling of the victims was finalized. For the High Command, Nedelin and his staff, the aviation accident narrative required bodies. Sealed, zinc-lined caskets were prepared in Moscow. They would be interred in the Kremlin wall with full state honors, their emptiness a guarded secret. For the hundreds of other victims, the technicians, engineers, and soldiers whose outlines had been scrubbed from the pad, there would be no such ceremony. Their families received heavily censored telegrams citing a vague death in the line of duty with no location, date, or cause provided. The few recovered physical fragments were interred in anonymous mass graves near the closed city of Leninsk, the site left unmarked. Finally, the living survivors were processed. The men in the bunker and the horrifically burned men in the medical bay were the greatest liability. As they recovered, each was brought individually before a KGB tribunal. They were forced to sign a state-enforced, lifelong non-disclosure agreement. The document explicitly forbade them from ever communicating, in any form, what they had witnessed on October 24th under penalty of charges of high treason. Immediately following this, they were all given new assignments and scattered across the Soviet Union, from Arctic submarine bases to Far East radar stations, isolating them from one another to prevent their collective memory from ever consolidating. The C file was stamped top secret, bound, and dispatched to the archive, where it would remain buried for 3 decades. The denial was now total, the victims officially forgotten, and the state's version of history was the only one permitted to exist.